to discuss ways to look at promoting charitable giving in America. Our people are generous, and that's why charity is one of the key incentives that's right at the heart of the American tax code, and it is a top priority for Democrats and Republicans on this committee. My own view is that the charitable tax deduction is a lifeline and not a loophole. There's never been more accuracy in that than there was in early 2020 when the pandemic arrived in the United States. Over the course of a few weeks in March, that pandemic wiped out 250,000 jobs in my home state of Oregon. Our state has a workforce of just over 2 million people. In a flash, Oregon's unemployment rate jumped by 10 percentage points. As terrible as those figures are, other states had it even worse. More than 22 million Americans lost their jobs or had their hours reduced to zero. The unemployment rate hit 14.8%, the highest ever recorded. That economic devastation added to a hunger crisis that's been causing pain for American families for far too long. According to the Children's Defense Fund, prior to the pandemic, more than 10 million American kids grew up in households where they just didn't have enough to eat. Black and Latino families were twice as likely to be short on food. And again, that was the situation before anybody had heard of COVID-19. The crisis exploded in 2020. Everybody remembers the images of cars stacked up for miles outside of food pantries. My good friend Susanna Morgan is here, longtime leader of the Oregon Food Bank. I was out there with her at those food pantries where we were putting the boxes of food into those cars that just came one after another for just, it seemed like forever. There was an added challenge of feeding vulnerable kids, many of whom were unable to get the free lunches they rely on at school for nutrition. So as you probably picked up, I think we're very fortunate to have my Portland neighbor, Susanna Morgan, the CEO of the Oregon Food Bank, with us. She'll describe how the crisis hit Oregon families like a wrecking ball, as well as how her terrific organization was able to respond through the 1,400 pantries it supports across Oregon and into Southwest Washington. The record shows that in 2020, in Oregon and across the country, Americans stepped up again and again when their neighbors needed help. Charitable giving reached new highs. The federal and state governments stepped up. Now, there's some important lessons this committee ought to consider as we go forward, because there are still millions and millions of people across the country who need support. Organizations like the Oregon Food Bank are still seeing demand at higher levels than they did in 2019. Two quick examples. First, the CARES Act, which the Congress passed in March of 2020, included a tax deduction for charitable donations of up to $300 for the vast majority of taxpayers who do not itemize their tax returns. The 2017 tax law took some of the punch out of the existing charitable deduction by greatly reducing the number of taxpayers who itemize. So the new $300 deduction helped to correct that big flaw in the 2017 law, and it helped promote giving in 2020. It was extended and expanded in 2021, but expired on January 1. I believe there's going to be bipartisan interest in reviving it and expanding it to promote even more giving. Second, in addition to promoting donations, the Senate also ought to be looking at ways to help our nonprofits operate. Let's help them keep their doors open and keep their workers on the job. The CARES Act created an employee retention tax credit that saved a lot of jobs nationwide. It was extended and expanded in 2021. The credit was designed with parity for nonprofits in mind, so that these nonprofits and their workers could certify and benefit just like other employers. Last year, with Senator Brown, Senator Klobuchar, and Senator Schatz, I also introduced a bill called the Work Now Act. That would also help nonprofits grow and hire. It would create a new grant program to help nonprofits retain staff, hire the unemployed, while also supporting efforts to scale up the services that are offered. Let me just close by saying this. Organizations like the Oregon Food Bank, and we're lucky to have them in virtually every nook and cranny of our country. Those organizations are the backbone of America. In addition to promoting charitable giving, it's a no-brainer that the Congress ought to find smart ways to help our nonprofits do their essential work as well. Lots for the community to discuss. I want to thank our witnesses for joining the committee, and I also want to express my appreciation to members of the Finance Committee. This will be the close of what amounts to a triple header for the committee this week. We began the week with a very important hearing looking at security and trade issues relating to the Indo-Pacific. Yesterday, we dealt with the enormously important question of finally getting relief to Americans who are just getting crushed by these prescription drug bills. And today, we're going to look at how to promote charitable giving. So I want to thank my colleagues. That's a pretty big load. There's a lot going on this week in the United States Senate. Let me recognize Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thanks for holding this hearing. It is an extremely important issue to be able to discuss the health of our nonprofit sector and how we can support and encourage their continued work. This is an issue that's very near and dear to me. I served for more than 20 years with nonprofits. I'm very passionate about the work of nonprofits, and this is also a policy issue for our nation as well. Let me first say thank you to those that serve in the nonprofit sector, both that are here and that are all over the country. You do remarkable work and are the real safety net in times of need. I tell people all the time, we really have three safety nets in America. While most folks look at government and say that's the safety net, we really have three different safety nets. The first one's the family. The second one is the community that's dominated by churches, nonprofits, both secular and faith-based nonprofits that are out there. And then the third is government. If the family fails and if the local community and the nonprofits are not able to meet the need, then government is the third option there. So the key aspect is to be able to make sure all three of those safety nets stay healthy and then stay able to be able to do their task. That's what happened during COVID-19, quite frankly. Our charities and our nonprofits rose to the occasion. They serve countless Americans facing uncertainty and difficulty all across the country. But they weren't immune either from the effects of COVID-19 based on their workforce, their operations, their organizational structure itself. According to Johns Hopkins Center for Civil Society Studies 2020 Nonprofit Employment Report, during the first 3 months of the pandemic, from March through May of 2020, the nonprofit sector lost an estimated 1.6 million jobs, reducing the nonprofit sector by over 13%. As of the end of last year, the sector is still down nearly 500,000 jobs. We know that encouraging more Americans to give will help direct additional resources to nonprofits to ensure they can continue to provide vital services to our communities. In 2020, the CARES Act, we included a provision to allow taxpayers to take a deduction of up to $300 for charitable gifts they make. Then in December of 2020, we extended that provision so that taxpayers could deduct $300 or $600 for joint filers for gifts given in 2021. As a result of that, we had a record amount of giving in 2020 to nonprofits. Unfortunately, this provision expired at the end of last year. This provision is a non-itemizer charitable deduction, acts as both a lifeline to our nonprofit sector who felt the effects of COVID-19, and it also answers the call to service. It's an incentive for people to be able to give. Now, we're again reminded how crucial these organizations are, both in local communities and internationally, as we see the nonprofit community respond to the devastating crisis in Ukraine currently. They're supporting Ukrainian citizens with care, housing, and food, and that's being done by a tremendous number of nonprofits. Having the charitable deduction in place can incentivize even more giving at critical times like these. This provision is something I'm very passionate about and have worked on for several years with a great group of partners through the introduction of the Universal Giving Pandemic Response and Recovery Act last year. I have folks that catch me all the time and say, Americans are very generous. They will give without the tax deduction. So the tax deduction is not necessary to encourage Americans to give. I always smile at them and say, go to any nonprofit in America, pick any one of them, and ask what their highest month of giving is. And they will always smile at you and say, December. That is not because of the Christmas spirit. It is because that's the end of the tax year, and they know if they're going to get the deduction, they have to do it right now, which is also why for many nonprofits in 2020 and 2021, they had a very large number of gifts the last week of December of $300, the exact amount of that tax incentive. I thank nonprofits for their work, and I want to make sure that we continue to be able to encourage their work as the safety net in our society. For all of you that are experts on this panel today, thank you for giving your time and your effort, both in your written testimony and the oral testimony you'll give. I thank you for your steadfast dedication to your work. Mr. Chairman, I also ask that Ranking Member Crapo's opening statement be included in the record.
Absolutely, we will do that, and we're all going to work as we've done on a bipartisan basis on these issues. You know, Senator Langford, we're going to go to the witnesses in a moment, touches on an important point. People say, why do we need anything in the tax code? We're a good people. We're going to give. We're going to help. I share that view. I mean, we're going to help, and there's no question about it. But as I indicated, you know, I think the charitable tax deduction is a lifeline. And based on everything I have seen, it does affect the number of gifts someone can make and the size of the gift. So that's what this debate's all about, and this committee has a strong history of being supportive of charities, and we're going to continue that. Let's go right to, let me introduce our witnesses, and then we'll go right to them. Our first witness is Dan Cardinale, the President and CEO of the Independent Sector, national organization of nonprofits. Our second witness is Susanna Morgan, of course, the inimitable CEO of the Oregon Food Bank. Our third witness is Una Osili, who is the chair in philanthropy and associate dean for research and international programs at the Indiana University Lilly Family School. Our fourth witness is well known to many on this committee, Gene Steuerle, co-founder of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, the Urban Institute Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy, and Act for Alexandria. Thank you all for coming. We're going to make your prepared statements a part of the record. Mr. Cardinale, lead us off.
Thank you very much. Chairman Wyden, Senator Langford, and members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing, for the opportunity to share a perspective today. I serve as President and CEO of Independent Sector, a national membership organization made up of nonprofits, foundations, and corporate giving programs nationwide. Our members and their networks reach into every state and district and touch every life in America. I've spent my entire professional life working and volunteering in the charitable sector. It is clear to me that despite the tectonic shifts we are living through, our nation's charitable spirit is alive and well. It is also evident to me that that spirit is not fully unleashed. The charitable sector is the foundation on which our democracy is built and continues to evolve. When this foundation is weak, so is our nation. The charitable sector is also the engine of our collective flourishing, the place where people come together to solve problems, a trusted partner for community and government leaders, and our economy's third largest employer. For generations, policymakers have recognized the importance of this sector by providing a tax deduction for donations made to charity. They understand that by incentivizing Americans to support the charitable sector, the nation can do more collective good beyond government and individuals going alone. Today, the charitable sector is made up of about 1.8 million organizations, 12 million professional staff, and nearly 70 million volunteers. But despite that strength, it is not immune to the ravages of domestic and global challenges. With the loss of over 1.6 million jobs during the pandemic, the sector is still struggling to recover. It lags well behind the for-profit recovery and is still down almost 500,000 jobs. At the same time, organizations have had to adapt to new operational challenges while facing increased demand of services. With that, let me discuss how Congress and the charitable sector can work together to strengthen civil society and help people thrive. In 2020, Congress created a temporary charitable deduction for non-itemizers, but allowed it to expire at the end of last year. Every day that this lifeline remains expired is a blow to our charitable recovery and a missed opportunity for those in need. I urge you, in the strongest possible terms, to restore the non-itemizer charitable deduction quickly and to significantly increase or eliminate the cap. We are grateful to the members and the leaders of this committee who worked for the creation of that deduction and who continue to work for its restoration and expansion. Restoring and expanding the itemizer charitable deduction is essential to generating giving at a scale that our nation actually needs. However, this is not just a conversation about dollars. The non-itemizer deduction also sends a powerful message to combat the decade-long decline in the number of Americans who give to charity at all. A charitable sector that is funded by the wealthy will look very differently and will serve America very differently. I hope you will keep in mind the unique nature of the charitable deduction. By definition, a donor receives no direct benefit for their gift. The charitable deduction simply encourages taxpayers to give away a portion of their income to benefit others. In addition to restoring and expanding the non-itemizer charitable deduction, I also urge you to take action on 4 key priorities that are addressed in my written testimony. First, I urge you to restore the employee retention tax credit, which is critical in helping nonprofits keep people employed and serving their communities. Second, I ask you to pass the Legacy IRA Act, which would expand the opportunity for seniors to make contributions to charity through their retirement accounts. Third, I ask you increase the charitable mileage rate to be on par with the business rate, at least temporarily, which can bolster our diminishing volunteer force. Lastly, I ask you to consider a set of policy solutions that are needed to strengthen the partnership between nonprofits and the federal government as a whole. I would welcome the opportunity to discuss these solutions, which we call the Seat at the Table initiative, either today or in future weeks ahead. So I want to thank you for your support and opportunity to testify today. The charitable sector will continue to step up to respond to the needs of society, and with your support, we'll build upon this work to ensure that all people thrive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cardinale. Ms. Morgan, welcome.
Good morning. Chairman Wyden, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to share my on-the-ground perspective regarding charitable giving in the nonprofit sector. My name is Susanna Morgan, and I'm the CEO of Oregon Food Bank. Our network is among the largest in the country, with a central warehouse that provides resources to 21 regional food banks, which then support over 1,400 pantries, free food markets, and meal sites across Oregon and Southwest Washington. Our mission is to end hunger and its root causes. To build communities that never know hungry, we need living wage jobs, affordable housing and childcare, and protection from discrimination. And when we hit tough times, we need government safety nets, like SNAP, to ensure everyone has access to food. Food banks should be the last resort when other systems have failed, and food alone will never solve hunger. I have worked in anti-hunger efforts for 26 years across several states, and the past 2 years have been the most challenging of my career. More than 865,000 people sought emergency food assistance through the Oregon Food Bank Network in 2019, nearly 1 in 5 of our neighbors. In 2020, this number rose like a tsunami to a jaw-dropping height of 1.7 million people, and in 2021 remained painfully high at over 1 million of our neighbors. Even with the outpouring of community support, we couldn't have kept food flowing without significant state and federal action. As we began to run out of food due to the enormous increase in demand, Governor Brown came through with $1 million a week for food purchases until USDA commodities arrived through the CARES Act. Congressional aid reached communities directly through enhanced unemployment and SNAP benefits, relief payments to families, and more. The child tax credit alone drove down child poverty by an incredible 41% and reduced food insecurity by 26%. Combined, these actions helped us to meet the crisis head on and ensure that hunger did not spiral out of control. Charitable giving incentives were an important piece of this equation as well. Let me share one extraordinary week I had tied to decisions made by this committee. On a Monday, early in the pandemic, my colleague in the Dalles, Oregon, called me over the moon excited because she had just located the perfect building for a regional food bank. The purchase price was $750,000. On Wednesday, a local philanthropist expressed interest in making a $1 million donation, thanks in part to tax law changes that allowed 100% deduction of her adjusted gross income. On Friday, she committed to fund the purchase of the building in what is surely the shortest capital campaign ever. The work of this committee clearly influences expressions of love and generosity in our communities. Yet from where I sit, it is incredibly important that you consider how future tax policy changes may impact federal revenue. Even at our scale in Oregon, for every meal we provide, SNAP provides 10. Charity organizations simply cannot replace federal funding for the programs and resources our families need to thrive. So I humbly ask you to act to strengthen federal revenue and advance policies that prevent hunger from happening. The best thing Congress can do to reduce hunger is to invest in proven solutions that support families directly. Reinstate the child tax credit. Modernize SNAP to reflect the true cost of healthy food. Invest in housing and childcare. Raise revenue by requiring the wealthiest corporations, individuals, and estates to pay what they owe. And it's important that any new incentives are designed to encourage charitable giving that helps our communities now. Hunger is a crisis today, and charitable support is needed now, not tucked away for some hypothetical future. Sustain the 100% adjusted gross income deduction. Increase the amount private foundations must grant annually. Ensure donor-advised funds have minimum annual distributions and spend down timelines. As we speak, our communities face uncertainty around the impact of global events, the cost of living, and whether a new variant might emerge. Hunger remains an epidemic. This isn't over. We need Congress to continue supporting our neighbors through proven policies, and I believe that together we can still emerge stronger. It's been an honor to be with you today. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Morgan. And I was smiling about a couple of things. One, on the ground, I've seen you in action getting all those boxes of food out. And I think you gave us a theme that everybody can connect with, and that is never know hungry. Says it all. Thank you for all your work. Our third witness, Dr. Unala Osili, Chair in Philanthropy at Indiana University. Thanks for coming.
Chairman Wyden, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today about how the pandemic is influencing charitable giving. Philanthropy has long been a cornerstone of our nation, even before we were a nation. Many early Native American giving traditions were rooted in mutual responsibility and reciprocity. Philanthropy, both formal and informal, has played a visible role in responding to the pandemic. During the COVID-19 era, philanthropy has been unprecedented in size, scale, and scope. Religious congregations, grassroots organizations, community foundations, and nonprofits in areas such as health and food insecurity have demonstrated resilience and creativity in meeting urgent needs. It's important to emphasize that charitable giving grew during the first year of a global pandemic, with 2020 being the highest year of charitable giving on record at $471 billion. Total philanthropy increased by 3.8% in inflation-adjusted terms. 69% of this total was contributed by living individuals. Foundations, charitable bequests, and corporations account for the remaining 31%. Research has long established that charitable giving is linked with key economic, financial, and social factors. In 2020, giving was linked with robust end-of-the-year financial markets, increased needs, and a heightened awareness of the racial justice movement. Furthermore, with rising economic and health insecurity, the philanthropic sector is facing greater demand for services, and nonprofit organizations are adapting to new technology, staffing shortages, and virtual modes of engagement. In 2020, online giving increased by 21%. Philanthropy is also playing a vital and increasingly visible role in the global economy. The outpouring of cross-border generosity in response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been tremendous, and private donors are addressing global needs using new vehicles, including crowdfunding, cryptocurrency, and collective giving. Despite this progress, addressing humanitarian issues, including the war in Ukraine, will require an acceleration of efforts to harness private sector resources. The 2022 Global Philanthropy Environment Index identifies obstacles to expanding these cross-border philanthropic flows. In particular, the index finds more than a third of the 91 economies reported restrictive policies on cross-border giving. While total charitable giving has been increasing during the global pandemic, the racial justice movement, and the unfolding humanitarian crisis, we have to be concerned about post-pandemic giving patterns by Americans of all income backgrounds. Despite the economic upheaval induced by COVID-19, recent data show that affluent households remain committed to charitable organizations, with 88% giving to charity in 2020, consistent with the 90% rate measured in 2017. However, recent data from the Philanthropy Panel study, the most comprehensive study of American giving, shows that the fraction of low and middle income American households that contribute to charity decreased from 2/3 to half, a decline of 17 percentage points between 2000 and 2018. For younger Americans, declines in giving rates have been significant. Looking ahead, we have an opportunity to address issues of equity and efficiency among donors and nonprofits, since giving is becoming more concentrated among high-income households. A growing body of work has examined the effects of extending the charitable deduction to non-itemizers. Results indicate that a non-itemizer charitable deduction could increase charitable donations and induce an expansion in the number of households that give. There are many issues to consider when investigating the impact of tax policies. Nonprofit leaders and policymakers will need to consider the effect of tax policy on charitable giving dollars, the number of households that donate, treasury revenue, and issues of donor equity and efficiency. Making timely decisions about policies that support and enhance the long-standing norms and traditions of American generosity can help us strengthen the role of philanthropy now and in the future. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
We will have some momentarily. Mr. Steuerle. Dr. Steuerle, excuse me. No, Dr. Steuerle, please.
Mr. Chairman, I'm honored again to testify before you. The views expressed in my testimony are my own and should not be attributed to the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, their trustees, or funders. While a temporary increase in the standard deduction substantially benefited many taxpayers, it contributed to a reduction in charitable tax subsidies by about 30% and left only about 1/10 of households taking a charitable deduction. I doubt that Congress or the public will long support such a narrowly targeted lifeline, in your own words, Senator Wyden. I view this as a great opportunity to reform incentives and strengthen the communal efforts that have long defined our nation. And my job, as I've been requested, is to talk about some of the trade-offs for the amount of money that Congress might be willing to put forward. You'll be getting many suggestions for reforms, including mine, but my primary suggestion is to pick among them only after comparing options under a cost-effective rubric and put gains for the community, for the charitable beneficiaries, as the major objective of the effort. The classic distribution and revenue tables that we get when we do tax analysis do not actually measure directly what goes to the charitable beneficiaries. And there are three parties, as you said, Senator Langford, to this transaction: the household or taxpayer, the community, and the taxpayer, the community, and the Treasury, sorry. That is whether you decide in favor of, say, the $50 billion of current annual subsidies that go to Treasury charities under current law, or the $70 billion that was available under current law. Compare options on a cost-neutral basis. Then have your talented joint committee staff show the net amount of giving going to the charitable beneficiaries under different combinations. Finally, when shown any particular option, always consider alternatives that would generate more gains for the community and for charitable beneficiaries and fewer windfalls for taxpayers. The rest of my testimony focuses primarily on 4 issues. First, relative to cost, gains for charitable beneficiaries will be greatly limited by caps on deductions, and they'll be enhanced through floors that limit the amount of giving to the excess of or something like 1% or more of AGI. Second, almost all proposals for an expanded deduction provide windfalls to a group we call switchers, those itemizers who switch to the standard deduction and then take the new charitable deduction. There's often no gain for charitable beneficiaries at all from those switches. Third, gains for charitable beneficiaries can be further enhanced by exchanging improved compliance for a stronger incentive. And fourth, many of the most cost-effective reforms, such as allowing deductions at time of tax filing, take advantages of insights from behavioral science. Again, Senator Langford, you referred to this when you referred to people thinking about giving at the end of December. They also think about giving when they file their tax returns. So why do caps and ceilings matter? Well, caps concentrate incentives onto giving that would occur anyway, while floors concentrate them on giving beyond what one would do in absence of a tax subsidy. As one example, compare a universal deduction with and without a 1% floor. Using research methods commonly applied, failure to provide a floor cost Treasury $17 billion while generating only $2 billion extra for charitable recipients and $15 billion in windfalls for taxpayers, simply because of not accepting that type of floor. Any reform should also account for IRS's very limited ability to administer hundreds of millions of charitable transactions under current, outdated systems of reporting. Fortunately, this is an opportune time for Congress to create a system of electronic filing for charitable contributions. I have little doubt that third-party intermediaries can create an efficient system of reporting to IRS, and we could use the revenues that would be picked up from improved compliance to provide a higher and better incentive for charities and for their recipients of their output of goods and services. Finally, behavioral science suggests that high bang per buck reforms that allow deductions at time of tax filing simplify life for donors of their lottery winnings and provide matching grants to charities. In sum, charitable deduction reform can strengthen our nation's long-standing tradition of giving and working together. To provide maximum gains for charitable beneficiaries in the community at whatever level of subsidy Congress decides, consider how caps significantly weaken and floors significantly strengthen the incentive provided. At the same time, we need to decrease rather than add to compliance burdens for IRS and consider how making incentives more salient can add to charitable giving. Thank you for this opportunity to testify before you, and I would be glad to work with you on these issues in the future.
Right. Thank you. But let me see if I can do a couple of points quickly. Is it correct that we're now seeing a need for assistance exceeding 2020 levels and that each of you expect that to continue? Is that correct? Is there any dissent at the table? Everybody agree with that? Free to dissent. That's why we have hearings, debates.
Yes. So I'm not sure that I disagree with one point that I would add to that, if you dig into the numbers, there have been a number of extraordinarily wealthy people making enormous gifts that have perhaps distorted the numbers slightly around the amount of giving. So it would be worth digging into the numbers and seeing the impact of some very large philanthropic gifts, which seem atypical, and whether they'll be sustained or not is a question I think we're all wondering.
But on the basic proposition that the need for assistance exceeds 2020 levels. You expect that to continue with some possible ramifications for very large gifts.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So the second question stems from the first. Do you believe that the current donations and grants, for the most part, and let's take Mr. Cardinale's point as a thoughtful one, do you think current donations and grants are sufficient to meet the needs? I'm pretty sure you all said no. Anybody disagree with that? Okay. We'll put that one down as a no. Don't be bashful, because I'm like absorbing your very important points.
Senator, and this is Dr. Osili's numbers, charitable giving, even at 2020 levels, is not at past peak levels as a share of our income. And as our economy has grown, sixfold over the last century, our ability to increase giving, that share of giving has not really occurred. So I think all of us believe that we could do much more as a nation on this front.
Very good. So it's always important to look at both past, because it's a guide to prologue, and to kind of weigh, as Mr. Steuerle did, the trade-offs. Which programs, let's just go right down the line here. Which programs, we passed some novel programs to respond to the pandemic. Which programs were the most successful based on your hard evidence? We'll start with you, Mr. Cardinale.
I think many of them were very effective, but I would say three that come to mind. The first would be the Paycheck Protection Program, which protected 4.1 million jobs, according to the Johnson Center on Philanthropy, keeping frontline workers engaged during a pandemic. The second, of course, would have been the CARES Act and incentivizing giving that enabled people to reach into their pocket and incentivize everybody to do that, whether they could get out the door and volunteer, they could certainly write a check and donate. And third would be what Ms. Morgan mentioned, or what I would also agree with around the employment retention tax credit. And it kept employees.
Programs most effective, Ms. Morgan.
Child tax credit, Senator Wyden, which drove down child poverty and child hunger to rates I haven't seen in 26 years. I've been in anti-hunger work for 26 years, and we haven't ended hunger yet. And we're not stopping until we do. And so, yes, we need the charitable incentives, and we need federal response. This is a both and.
Okay. Professor.
Yes, I would agree that the CARES Act overall, the PPP program, and the direct stimulus payments to households really strengthened the country's ability to withstand the pandemic. And in particular, the Penn-Wharton budget models estimate that the impact of these stimulus packages boosted GDP 5.5%. We think about what drives charitable giving. Incentives certainly affect not just the amount that people give, but the vehicles they use and the timing of those gifts. In addition, economic factors affect their ability to give in the first place. So American households give when they have the resources, the means to give, and the charitable deduction and the incentives provide that boost, you could say, around the timing, the amount, and the vehicles.
Dr. Steuerle.
I would include Paycheck Protection. As a founder of the Community Foundation in Alexandria, I would also say even the support that went to the cities actually came back out through our Community Foundation and through all the charities in Alexandria right across the river to support many of the efforts to provide food, shelter, clothing, and other items that have been made possible. So it actually extends far beyond just even what's in the tax code. I suppose by one exception, Senator Wyden, was I think most of these provisions were good as temporary provisions, but such items as the $300 deduction, I think most estimates suggest that it does not provide much of an incentive in the long run because it's not applied at the margin. People who give more than $300, it's a windfall in the form of a tax break. I think it was a good symbol during the crisis, but as a long-term prospect, just like Paycheck Protection, I think we have to look further.
I have long watched your scholarship on this and share much of your thinking. This was particularly important because we wanted to give more people an opportunity to be involved. That was the point. You know, the 2017 tax bill said, yeah, you got opportunities if you're really up at the top of the economic system. The whole point of the $300 effort was to get more people mobilized at the grassroots and talking about why they were helping our wonderful Oregon Food Bank. We'll continue this discussion. Also, Dr. Steuerle, I would like you to flesh out for the finance staff how you envision this set of electronic improvements as it relates to charitable giving, because we know that the IRS is in the dark ages with respect to technology. The comprehensive budget that passed last week is going to get them hundreds of millions of dollars more, so we're moving in the right direction. But if you got some ideas that are doable and cost-effective, I'm all ears. Thank you all, and let's go to Senator Langford.
Yeah, thank you. As I mentioned before, and as several of you have mentioned on this, this is something that I think is extremely important that we deal with, is non-itemizer charitable deduction to incentivize more donations on the lower end and to be able to keep that going. The data, I think, also supports this, and we've talked about it a little bit, but I want to raise a couple of things and some stories here. Compared to 2019, after the $300 deduction was enacted in the CARES Act, gifts of less than $250 grew by 15% in 2020. So contrary to most examples of growth in giving during the times of crisis, typically the growth in these small gifts outpaced the growth in larger contributions by 1.5 times. When compared to 2019, there was a 28% increase in $300 donations on the final day of 2020. That's the exact amount of actually what the donation amount was. So there's obviously some connection there. And I wonder what that would have been if the number would have been higher for that time period as well. According to the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, compared 2019 to 2020, the overall number of donors grew by 7% in 2020. New donors increased by 18%, and overall giving increased by over 10%. On top of that, based on their analysis of over $46 billion in charitable giving, the Black Bond Institute estimates that charitable giving in the U.S. grew by 9% in 2021. So, how do we keep this going? And how do we continue to be able to fan the flame of this? I would tell you it is significant, and we've seen it be significant. Let me just give you a few stories from my state in Oklahoma. Amy from Family and Children's Services was writing and said, when the new tax laws were amended during the pandemic, it actually gave me more incentive to dig deeper because I knew that not only would the nonprofit organization get the proceeds they needed, but I also got something in return to help my spending that wasn't available to me prior to this. It was a win-win. Tom, who's the Chief Development Officer at Family and Children's Services in Tulsa, said, I often get asked as a fundraiser for nonprofit, how is annual giving going? And have we seen a decline since we were not able to do in-person events? He said, in fact, we saw a 17% increase in first-time donors and amongst donors 40 years or younger. A few of them said that the tax deduction made them more generous, and they were able to do something even more than what they thought they could before because of that advantage. Melissa, who's the Director of Community Engagement and Remerge in Oklahoma City, said last year we had 10 gifts of $300. 3 of those donors were new donors who stated that the tax credit had impacted their decision in the size of their gift. Angie, who is the Chief Development and Marketing Officer at Sunbeam Family Services, a great group, said when universal tax deduction was enacted, Sunbeam experienced an increase both in total donations and the average donation amount. So we've seen not only just those stories, but a lot of other evidence. I have worked to be able to expand this. And I think we can further support our nonprofits. Several colleagues and I have joined together to expand this. Under our bill, taxpayers would be able to do a charitable deduction of a third of the standard deduction, just over $4,000 for single filers and $8,000 for joint filers. This bill ensures that every American gives, not just those with high incomes and those that itemize on their tax returns, others are able to give and to be able to give at larger amounts, and they're incentivized to do that. I do want to thank my fellow sponsors, Senator Coons, Lee, Shaheen, Tim Scott, Klobuchar, Collins, Cortez Masto, as well as other members of this committee that have co-sponsored the bill, Senator Stabenow, Hassan, and Brown, for their support. We do have a lot of support from the community on this bill as well. I have letters here with me today representing thousands of organizations in every state. We have one letter that the coalition has signed with 1,500 nonprofits that have signed on, and another with hundreds of local United Ways. Mr. Chairman, I believe these letters and others have already been submitted for the record, but I would ask that a few other letters that have also come in today be included in the record as well. The Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits, Faith and Giving, the Jewish Federations of North America, the National Philanthropic Trust, the National Council on Nonprofits, the Philanthropy Roundtable, and Philanthropy Southwest have all written in addition to that.
Without objection, they'll go into the record now.
So now that I've completely spoiled all of my time for questions, making a statement, I'd love to be able to visit with all of you at great length on this, but the chairman's an ogre on time, and so I'm going to have to be attentive on this. Mr. Cardinale, I do want to talk about how the deduction influences the behavior of non-itemizers. What have you seen on that?
Well, first of all, thank you for your leadership, and I think independent sector stands squarely behind pretty much everything you just said. The one additional item that's important is that by expanding the non-itemizer, we actually incentivize people to participate in their community. It expands a number of donors, and we know once a donor starts, there's a high probability that they will continue to grow, so we'll build out a pipeline, and it links to volunteerism. It gets them out into their communities, so they're donating and they're volunteering, and that builds civic trust. So 100% behind your points.
Thank you. I would only mention one other thing. Mr. Cardinale earlier said that by definition, when you're giving like this, it can't be beneficial to you. I would say when people give to nonprofits, it is very beneficial to them in the community and to them personally. The old, it's better to give than receive, definitely kicks in when you're giving on it.
It lifts the spirits. It makes you feel you're helping the community. Well said. Senator Grassley.
Oh, I thought you had a Democrat to go ahead.
We have you up at this time. Go ahead.
I'm very happy to go. Ms. Morgan, I'm going to start with you. You quote from your testimony, "Hunger is a crisis today and charitable support is needed now, not tucked away for some hypothetical future." End of quote. I'm sure that's a statement working charities in Iowa and across our country would agree with. Today, there is over $1 trillion sitting in private foundations and assets held by donor-advised funds totaling $160 billion, 360% increase since 2006. Senator King and I have introduced the Accelerating Charitable Efforts Act, which is focused on ensuring that tax-deductible contributions to a foundation or donor-advised fund reach their ultimate charitable destination within a reasonable period of time. Could you elaborate on why it's important for working charities like yours that that don't have hundreds of billions of dollars of charity money effectively sitting on the sidelines?
Thank you for the opportunity, Senator Grassley. The Oregon Food Bank has been greatly impacted by supply chain disruptions during the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, 865,000 people, that's 1 in 5 people in Oregon and Southwest Washington, asked for food assistance. And we relied heavily on donations from growers, food distributors, food manufacturers to meet the need. Supply chain disruptions have meant that donations are down well over 50% because they can't give us what they don't have in excess. And so we are purchasing food at a higher rate than we have ever purchased before. So we have more people who need food assistance and fewer resources in order to meet that food assistance. And so when I hear of wealthy folks tucking food money away, in hopes that they will make the future better, my response is make the future better right now for my neighbors who are struggling to put food on the table.
Thank you. Mr. Cardinale, I have a good history of working with your organization, probably a long time before you ever got involved in it, but they've helped me a lot during the early part of this century with a lot of investigations and reforms that I've done. We passed some legislation, but I also recall from the 2005-07 era that you put out some good work that helped us do probably even more than what we had intended to do by legislation. So I appreciate the independent sector's attention to the importance of robust self-regulation and oversight in fostering a healthy nonprofit sector. As I indicated before, I want to repeat, it was a pleasure working with your organization during my tenure as chairman of this committee in the 2000s to improve nonprofit governance and accountability. Could you elaborate on what the independent sector has been doing to foster good governance and self-regulation of nonprofit sector since the release of that report, quote, report on good governance and ethical practices, end of quote?
Thank you for the partnership, and it's been transformative in striking a balance. We think that is very healthy for a sector that has two components, one being self-regulation, where those principles that you referred to are still an extremely downloaded and used resource across the sector, setting a standard of good behavior, ethical governance, the use of appropriate fundraising, and a set of tools that allow people and boards to make good decisions about difficult challenges in a very kind of changing and dynamic world. But as you may recall well, that was also designed with appropriate government oversight. So that it's actually a two-part tension, self-regulation and government. So we, of course, denounce bad actors that take advantage of the sector. But that is a minority of folks that often make the news. But we do need appropriate support from the IRS and the exempt organization there to be able to lean into when there are bad actors so that we don't diminish public trust in America. We know that right now, every year we measure the trust that the general population has for nonprofits, and it's quite high, higher than government or business. So protecting that trust through striking the tension of appropriate self-regulation and appropriate government oversight. I do want to be clear, I am not calling for additional government oversight, just appropriate government oversight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. I believe next is Senator Carper.
That's what I didn't ask.
You out there, Senator Carper?
Senator Carper is here. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, colleagues and witnesses.
Senator Carper, turn the power up.
Can you hear me okay?
Is it our end?
I think it's at your end.
There you
am.
go. There you go. Perfect.
All right. All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Fine. Thank you. First of all, thank you for holding this very, very important hearing and a timely hearing. My wife and I are in the last week or two getting ready to submit all kind of tax-related materials to our CPA, and so we're reminded of we've actually been looking through our charitable giving, and so this is actually something that it's very, very real in our lives right now. We're trying to do our part, and I know others are too. But I want to thank each of our witnesses for your willingness to testify before a committee today. Nonprofit organizations and charities are an invaluable part of our communities in Delaware, and I know that's true across the country, and provide critical support for some of the most vulnerable among us. And throughout the coronavirus pandemic, nonprofits in Delaware and the other 49 states throughout America have risen to the occasion to help their neighbors keep a roof over their heads, put food on the table, get vaccinated, and a whole lot more. And when we support our local nonprofits, we show our commitment to building a stronger community. Having said that, research has found that as time goes by, fewer households are giving to charity. I think that's been mentioned a time or two already today. In fact, studies have shown that only about half of Americans are donating to charities these days. That's down from about 2 out of 3 like a couple of decades ago. And since then, donations, as I understand it, donations from lower and middle income households have declined. Charitable giving overall remains pretty much stable, but the increase is concentrated among higher income households, which is where you'd hope that we'd find that the most of the giving that takes place. A question, this would be for everybody on our panel, but could each of you take a couple of minutes to share your thoughts with us on why we are witnessing this decline in widespread charitable giving, what steps we ought to consider taking in order to reverse this trend. And at the same time, making sure that those who are capable of giving continue to do so. Please, in any order you would like to go.
I can
with the
start.
Irish
At the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, we've been tracking the share of Americans who give to charitable organizations. At the beginning of the 21st century, 2/3 of Americans gave, and this was fairly consistent over time until around the time of the Great Recession, where we saw that number begin to decline. It's important to note that when the economy recovered following the Great Recession, we did not see that number go up again. In fact, it has continued to decline, and at the most recent record in 2018, less than half of Americans gave for the very first time. It's also worth noting that among younger Americans, that decline has been more pronounced, and in fact, for the overall public, that percentage decline is 17 percentage points, but for younger Americans, it's more than 20% decline around the time of the Great Recession. So with that context,
how do you explain that? Young people.
How do we explain that? There are several factors to look at. We've investigated the role of economic factors. Changes in income, employment, wealth account for about 1/3 of that decline. The other half or so is due to a number of other factors. First, we've already heard about trust levels, declining levels of trust, social and social capital, but also religious participation has been shown to be linked not just to giving to religious congregations, but to giving more broadly. So looking ahead as we seek to continue to build this strong tradition of American generosity and make sure that it's broad-based across income and age groups, it's important to recognize that economic factors play a role, and certainly looking at the role that the charitable deduction plays, not just in providing an incentive, but sending a strong signal about the government's commitment to the private provision of public goods, but also the other factors. Trust, we've heard about what role trust plays, but also what the charitable sector can also do to continue to build the relationships, the engagement, and the sense of commitment that Americans.
I'm about to run out of time. I want to be able to hear from at least one other witness. Thank you for all that you just shared with us. Susanna Morgan, just a few thoughts from the Oregon Food Bank. The Delaware Food Bank sends their best to you and your team. Go ahead, Susanna.
Love our colleagues at the Delaware Food Bank. Thank you, Senator. I don't have academic data, but what I will tell you is that Oregon Food Bank had 40,000 new donors in the last 2 years. So we've gone from a database of 30,000 to a database of 70,000 donors in the last 2 years. So a combination of the environmental factors in which 1 in 4 people in Oregon were experiencing hunger. So everyone knew someone who was needing food assistance. This was not them, this was us. And hunger was impacting us. A combination of an outpouring of love, because that's really what community donations are. It is love in the form of a check for our community. And what the federal government did to support trust and to authorize and provide credibility to the nonprofit community through the tax code.
I wish I had time to ask others, but thank you all for joining us today.
Thank my colleague, Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to say thank you to the ranking member and Senator Langford for co-chairing this important committee with you. I also cannot thank you enough for just calling the hearing today to highlight what we see here is the good bipartisan work that Congress can do when we work together to be able to deliver for all Americans, including many of the nonprofits across the country and here today. As we know, the CARES Act established that charitable deduction for non-itemizers in 2020, and the COVID relief package passed in December of 2020 added an extension of the $300 charitable deduction for 2021. So I am proud to have worked with my colleagues on this committee, Senators Langford and Scott, to co-lead the bipartisan Universal Giving Pandemic Response Recovery Act to expand and extend a tax deduction for charitable giving. The bill would build on the bipartisan work and ensure that Nevadans who donate to charities, religious organizations, and other nonprofits are able to deduct their contributions from their federal taxes. This legislation recognizes the generous donations many Americans have given to these life-saving organizations and incentivizes further charitable giving during the coronavirus pandemic. I know firsthand that during the height of the challenging times of COVID-19, that nonprofits, community organizations, and religious organizations have provided immeasurable relief and support to struggling families in Nevada. Places like Betty's Village, which is an inclusive residential housing community for people of diverse abilities, was opened by Opportunity Village at the height of the pandemic. And I fought for the ability for nonprofits to qualify for that PPP loans during the pandemic. And because of that, my office was able to help them secure that loan and help provide housing and community for people of diverse abilities. By passing the Universal Giving Pandemic Response and Recovery Act, we can ensure nonprofits like Betty's Village can sustain the critical services they provide beyond the pandemic. So thank you again to our bipartisan partners in the Finance Committee, Senators Langford, Scott, Brown, Hassan, and Stabenow, for working on this important legislation. Let me start with Ms. Morgan. I so appreciate what you do. I am a big supporter of our Northern Nevada Food Bank in Reno and 3 Square and all of the food pantries across the country. So thank you for your commitment there. I also know I just recently had a roundtable discussion in Reno and included many of our community leaders, including members of the Northern Nevada Food Bank, to talk about the crisis parents are dealing with right now with the lack of access to affordable childcare. And I'm curious, you highlighted in your testimony how important the federal response was in addressing that tremendous need during the pandemic. It has since stopped. And can you discuss how critical support like the CTC was in meeting the overwhelming need, and how much harder it will be for organizations like yours to meet the community needs when you see an increase in that need over the last couple of years?
Thank you so much, Senator, and so much love to our colleagues in Nevada doing food banking work. The numbers tell the story, right? For us in Oregon in 2019, it was 860,000. In 2020, it was 1.7 million people asking for food assistance. And in 2021, it was just over 1 million. What's the difference between 2020 and 2021? The federal response. And in some cases, the reopening of economies as we became more accustomed to the pandemic. But from my analysis on the ground, is primarily the federal response. It was the increased unemployment. It was the direct payments to families. It was the child tax credit that made the difference, that folks did not have to show up at a food pantry and ask for a box of food. We want to live in a world where no one has to ask for food, where everybody can get all the food they need for their families. And we think that in partnership with the federal government, we can get there. So yeah, I'm scared about this year ahead as the provisions of the CARES Act and other federal provisions sunset. What then will happen? Are we going to see another tsunami of need? Are we going to see mothers crying in line because they're worried about feeding their babies? So thank you, Senator, and for the entire committee for everything you can do to help us help our communities.
Thank you. I yield the remainder of my time, although little it is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. Important points as always. I think Senator Thune is either online or let's see from.
Yep, Mr. Chairman, I'm online.
Great, terrific. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing on charitable giving, and thanks to our panelists for your testimony on behalf of the nonprofit and charitable sectors. Charitable giving is critical to local communities in South Dakota, and we need to continue to encourage this bipartisan priority in a fair and effective manner. In 2020, during the first year of the pandemic, charitable giving in the United States by individuals, bequests, foundations, and corporations reached a record high of $471 billion. Overall, charitable giving in the country in 2020 increased by 5.1% over 2019, and when adjusted for inflation, the total amount increased 3.8%. So my question, Dr. Osili, is can you tell us which categories of charitable giving saw the biggest increases in 2020 and why? And how do you think the pandemic has changed Americans' charitable giving patterns?
Thank you for that very insightful question. There were three factors that contributed to the growth in charitable giving. Certainly, number one, the recovery of the economy, especially strong financial markets at the end of 2020. We also had increased need, as we've heard from my colleague from Oregon. And in addition to that, we had the racial and social justice movement in 2020. So all those factors combined led to what we saw in terms of charitable giving. As we unpack the data, there were three areas that stood out in terms of increases. In particular, what we call public society benefit, which is the sector that has the umbrella of causes that includes donor advice funds, the national funds, also United Ways, United Jewish Appeals, and civil rights organizations were leaders in terms of charitable giving growth. We also saw strong growth in education and in basic needs charities, which includes organizations like the Oregon Food Bank. In terms of areas that did not perform as well in 2020, it's worth noting that arts and culture organizations were severely impacted by the pandemic because many of them were not able to hold in-person events, income-generating and fundraising events that usually involve face-to-face. So overall, the charitable sector grew, but not all organizations benefited, and certainly not all subsectors experienced the growth that we saw.
Thank you. So since the recent increase in the standard deduction, overall charitable giving amounts have gone up, but the number of individual itemized deductions claimed for charitable giving has gone down. And to put that another way, overall giving amounts have increased while the number of itemized donations have decreased. Mr. Steuerle, given the significant increase in the standard deduction, which resulted in fewer individual taxpayers itemizing deductions starting in 2018, are the estimates of non-itemizer giving before and after 2018 necessarily comparable? And could you speak to any current data that directly measures the magnitude of charitable giving by non-itemizers?
So we know in the years after 2017, in point of fact, giving did increase a bit. However, what also happened during that period was we were at the end of a long period of economic growth. We also had income actually increasing surprisingly in 2020 because of the federal subsidies that flowed through. So as Dr. Osili mentioned, we're not quite sure what's going to happen as we move forward into the future. In fact, there are a number of projections that say giving would decline. When you reduce the charitable incentive as much as happened in 2017, you essentially took 6 cents out of every dollar that was given to charity away from those charities. That is, the federal government used to provide about 21 cents on the dollar for charitable giving and dropped it to about 15 cents. So we think that that probably had some decline. Maybe it wasn't 6 cents, but it certainly wasn't zero in terms of its effect. There's something we don't measure well as economists. We're actually not good at measuring long-term effects of different provisions. And I think the symbolism and the signals provided by giving a deduction only to about 1/10 of taxpayers is pretty powerful. And it speaks to the earlier questions that you and some other senators have had about what we can expect for the future in terms of community participation. I think it sends a very bad signal. And I think I'm sure all the people at this table agree that we need to have a more universal set of incentives, partly just as a signal. I can't tell you what the full effect of that signal would be, but I think it would be quite powerful.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired, but let me just say how important it is that we encourage and incentivize charitable giving in this country. I don't think there's anything that we do as a matter of public policy that contributes more to meeting the needs of Americans in so many different areas of our economy. But certainly what happened during the pandemic is a reminder of the effectiveness of charitable giving and the need for us to play an active role in encouraging it. So thank you.
Senator Thune, thank you. And you and I have been fortunate enough to be able to lead a number of these bipartisan efforts to promote charity, and I look forward to continuing to work with you. We're happy to have Senator Cardin.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cardin, just one quick point before you proceed. I would just say to colleagues, we're getting down to wrapping up. And if colleagues on either side of the aisle would like to either come in person or be available to make their presentation online, now is the time to do it. Senator Cardin.
Well, Mr. Chairman, first, thank you for holding this hearing. I appreciate it very much. I think it's very important that we highlight what we can do in this committee's jurisdiction in regards to the nonprofit community. So thank you all very much. And I would ask consent that the statement from APRA Maryland chapter be made part of the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
I understand there's been a good deal of discussion about some of the tools that were made available during the coronavirus that affected the nonprofit community. I wear a hat as chair of the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee, so I appreciate the references to the Paycheck Protection Program particularly. I just really want to make an observation first. In the early stages of that negotiation, it was not certain at all that the nonprofit community was going to be included, because the Small Business Administration does not include the nonprofit community in many of its programs. So this was, the 7A program did not include this. This was a real expansion of the efforts on behalf of nonprofits. And it was clearly the right thing to do. The nonprofit community, there's so many small entities that have all the challenges of a small business. And during the pandemic, they were really hurt badly from the point of view of their financial sources, but as well their mission in order to carry it out. So I'm pleased that it was able to keep active and alive the nonprofit community, the tools that were made available through the Small Business Administration, bipartisan effort here in the United States. And I want to compliment the chair on the employee retention credit, which has also been mentioned. Senator Wyden was the leader on that particular initiative, and we thank him. And there was a moment where we were having challenges as to whether smaller entities were going to be able to participate, and Senator Wyden was our hero in keeping that there. I am distressed, Mr. Chairman, to learn that you're having challenges in getting that process through the IRS. And one of the things I think we can do as a committee is recognize that smaller entities, including nonprofits, don't have the financial wherewithal to be able to take on the bureaucracy as larger companies can. And we should really work to, in the administration of the IRS, for the sensitivity of smaller entities, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit. And I think, I know from the nonprofit community in Maryland, so many of them really need that particular help. And then lastly, I just really want to underscore the efforts that when we talk about the non-itemizer, the smaller contributors, those who are giving out to their community, again, it's usually, many of those dollars go to the smaller of the nonprofits. So once again, I think we need to have a sensitivity to smaller entities. I'm very happy about all the nonprofit community, believe me. But I do think we need to be able to help the smaller nonprofits deal with a lot of the bureaucratic issues we have, as well as the financial issues in the tax code itself. And I've asked the chairman, he's been cooperative here. I hope we'll have an opportunity to look at the Internal Revenue Code from the eyes of smaller entities and have policies that help deal with their realities in the tax code itself. I appreciate it. Any of you want to respond to that, it's fine. I just really, I know, Mr. Cardinale, I know you've been engaged in the smaller entities. Your comments?
So first of all, thank you, Senator, for your comments. I agree. ERTC has been game-changing. Appreciate the committee's leadership there. The Paycheck Protection Program saved 4.1 million jobs by the Johnson Center's estimates, which kept people employed and able to take care of our community during its pandemic. And this last point you make regarding strategies for the sector to actually fully be able to partner with government in a way that will allow it to best serve government, both as a resource as well as an implementer. We have been working with a piece of legislation that Representative McCollum has about to drop, we hope, called the Nonprofit Sector Strength and Partnership Act of 2022, which would basically establish permanently an Office of Nonprofits in the White House. It would set up an interagency council coordinated by that office, and then a federal group of bipartisan nonprofit leaders, so that we would not run the risk of having something like the Paycheck Protection Program be left to advocates on the outside. There would be people in government who would have a knowledge of how the sector needs to be supported. So thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
Senator Cardin, let me just follow up on the thoughtful points you made, and I think there may be an opportunity. Given the extra money that is going to the IRS that you and I in this committee strongly supported, because to a great extent, one of the areas we agree on is they're kind of in the dark ages on some of these issues relating to technology and having skilled individuals, and they're being able to recruit, because we found that Amazon was paying more than the IRS. I would be very interested in working with you on trying to make sure that some of that extra money that was just signed into law last week was for small business focused efforts as it relates to these issues. I'd be interested in your reaction. We're waiting for Senator Brown, but Senator Cardin, as is usually the case, is out in front with respect to being innovative. He's got ideas for making reforms in the entire agency with Senator Portman that we're looking forward to. But what about moving right now, given the fact that that money was just increased here in the last couple of days, to address some of the small business concerns you're talking about?
Well, I could tell you, having as my partner the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee will give me much better opportunity to get some results on the IRS. So I accept your partnership.
All right. I thank my colleague, and with that bold declaration that Senator Cardin has made, we can now have Senator Brown, a great friend of charities. Thank you, Senator Cardin. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Morgan, I'd like to start with you. You told us in your testimony that charity organizations simply cannot replace federal funding for the programs and resources our families need to thrive. I would do a real quick shout out to the work that United Ways all over Ohio have done in terms of of getting people connected to child tax credit and earned income tax credit. I know Chairman Wyden's not giving up on the importance of those and extending them, but put that aside for a second. The very first thing you said Congress should do to reduce hunger is reinstate the child tax credit expansion. That makes sense given we saw a significant drop in hunger levels. We saw a 40% drop in poverty. We know it relieves anxiety for families, particularly at the end of the month, and gives them, as someone said, the joy of a little bit of breathing room in their personal finances, especially when the rent's due at the end of the month. There are a number of us on this committee, along with so let me just back up for a second. So Ms. Morgan, if you would just tell us about your experience with the child tax credit and how the lapse in advance payments strain nonprofits like yours.
Thank you very much, Senator. As I've said before, we saw a huge tsunami of need in 2020, and that dropped in 2021. So what we were finding was our neighbors, and 70% of the people who work at Oregon Food Bank have experienced hunger. So it's our neighbors and us who were facing hunger, had the space to not have to go to a food pantry or a meal site, could instead go to a grocery store and ensure that they could put meals on the table for themselves and their families. And as you can imagine, as all of you can imagine, if you're hungry, nothing else matters. There's a Chinese proverb that says, the man who has food has many problems. The man who does not have food has one. Because it is a basic need. We all need to eat 3 times a day. We know that when Congress, when philanthropists invest in basic needs, it creates opportunity and space for all the other things. Better parenting, better education, better work habits. We have the opportunity to participate civically. So we meet our basic needs in order so that we can be fully human and fully American. And this is a great opportunity for Congress to continue to participate in that work.
Thank you very much, Ms. Morgan. My next question is for Mr. Cardinale. I've heard all around my state from nonprofits like the YMCA that the early termination of the employee retention tax credit really hurt. Many nonprofits relied on that credit when budgeting and planning for workforce needs. That's why I'm co-sponsoring Senator Hassan's bill to reinstate it. Give us a few examples, if you would, Mr. Cardinale, on how the early termination of ERTC actually hurt nonprofits.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for your leadership in Ohio and nationally. I can give you a very concrete example about not just the early termination, but actually something that was mentioned earlier regarding the IRS and their slowness in being able to actually provide these reimbursements. So specifically, an example out of Maryland that has received just this week, I think it was submitted by one of the senators, that in 2021 they have received their credit, but they have not received either payment from 2020. So not only are we looking at the importance of it, the ERTC as a way of nonprofits keeping themselves employed, which was a great innovation. I want to thank the committee again for it. It was a game changer. But now having it being repealed in the last quarter really threw off planning. Anybody who's run a nonprofit knows that you have to plan very carefully on cash flows, and you rely on both public and private sources. And when you get a massive disruption, it not only throws off the individual employees that you may not be able to pay, but your operations and destabilizes your culture internally. So I would just encourage this committee to double down on reinstating the ERTC and ensuring that the IRS is able to have the resources necessary to be able to get those reimbursements in a timely manner.
Thank you, Mr. Cardinale and Ms. Morgan. I will just make a closing comment. I don't want to go over the time. I know we're diligent on this committee, and the chair is really leading on this to make sure the IRS has the resources and workforce it needs to carry out its mission after years of underfunding. It was so impressive, even with that shrunk staff, if you will, how we passed the child tax credit. Senator Bennett and especially on this committee, and I worked together with the chairman. And passed it in March, immediately talked to the Secretary of the Treasury, and those checks were out the door July 15th, August 15th, September 15th, October 15th. And in my state, literally 2.2 million, the families of 2.2 million children benefited from that. And we know the difference it made, and not just cutting the rate of poverty, the difference it made, and just make people's lives better and a little bit easier. So it's really important that the overworked and under-resourced IRS gets the help that it needs. And I thank all of you for that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the time.
Thank you, Senator Brown. And Susanna Morgan spoke for a lot of Oregonians when she said right out of the gate how much she appreciated the child tax credits. And you and Senator Bennett on this committee, supported by Senator Casey, as well, have been the ringleaders in it. And it's one of the things I'm proudest that this committee has led on is dollar for dollar. It's making a huge difference for kids. And we know in our hometown, you know this, Ms. Morgan, when I go out and ask people, what'd you spend the child tax credit on? They say things like shoes for kids. We hear shoes. In our part of the world, it rains once in a while. Shoes are really important. So thank you and Senator Brown and Senator Bennett and Senator Casey for all the leadership on it. Now we're going to go in order of appearance. Senator Young is next, and then Senator Casey.
Thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing. And I want to welcome our witnesses, in particular, Dr. Osili, fellow Hoosier. Grateful for your presence here today. And I would like to begin by asking a couple of questions about community foundations. We take great pride in our community foundations in the state of Indiana. And Dr. Osili, as you know, beginning in 1990, the Lilly Endowment began an initiative known as GIFT, or Giving Indiana Funds for Tomorrow. This is a way to help establish and strengthen community foundations across the state of Indiana. When GIFT began, there were fewer than 12 community foundations, and today there are 94 community foundations. We have 92 counties, so of course that's more than one per county. Indiana is the only state in the country with a community foundation in every single county, and we have the country's highest concentration of community foundations. Dr. Osili, how does this structure, the only state in the country with a community foundation in every single county, enable our state to better serve local communities?
Thank you, Senator Young, for your leadership. Indiana is unique. We have, as you've noted, a community foundation in every single county, probably the highest concentration of any state in the country. There are over 700 community foundations nationwide. What we've seen in this crisis is community foundations have played a vital role, not just in collaborating and coordinating, but also avoiding duplication and connecting donors to needs. One takeaway from the work in Indiana is the idea that every single American is a philanthropist. You don't have to have millions of dollars. People of all different backgrounds can participate. And in this crisis, in our communities, community foundations have been the conveners, the collaborators, and also catalysts for innovation, bringing new ideas to the forefront and helping donors to better understand those local community needs. So I think there's some important examples and models that other states and other communities can learn from. So thank you for mentioning that.
Well, that was an excellent segue, Dr. Osili, because it begs the question, since we're in Washington, D.C., and I know my colleagues and their staff are watching attentively. Are there major barriers that you might speak to establishing more community foundations around the country?
We have an endowed chair in community philanthropy at the Indiana University Lilly Family School. Her name is Dr. Lori Paulberg. And one point she has noted is that in every state, there is the potential, of course, to expand the work of community foundations, but every state is different. And we have to look at what those barriers are at a state level. What we have seen that has really worked in Indiana is having foundations that are willing to help support through matching grants programs. But in other states, we've had incentives for contributions to community foundations. I think Kansas is one of them, where there is an incentive. So as we look across and how to support community foundations, I think what we've learned so far is just the role that they play. And I think my colleague, Dr. Gene Steuerle, can also share his example here in Virginia, that they can really help support that sort of leadership and innovation that's often lacking in a crisis.
Well, thank you, Doctor. And I'll be submitting for the record some questions to the other witnesses if you have thoughts on barriers that we can eliminate to ensure there's greater uptake in community foundations. And you can learn from what we'll take some liberties and call the Indiana model. That would be fantastic. So in my remaining bit of time here, Dr. Osili, I would like to highlight just a column you wrote recently for the Indianapolis Business Journal. You stated that the pace of technological innovation in the philanthropic sector is increasing, and it's going to need to accelerate this year and in future years. We've had some real notable examples where Central Indiana Community Foundation has partnered with an Indianapolis-based tech company selflessly and met with some success in ensuring that companies have the tools to track and manage their charitable giving. In short, Dr. Osili, I'll again submit some questions to you to ask in greater detail about this topic, but why is it so important for organizations in the charitable giving space to embrace technological innovation?
Excellent question, Senator Young. Just to put this in perspective, online giving, as we've noted, grew by double digits over the last year. And today, online giving accounts for 10% of charitable giving overall, its highest ever on record. What this means is nonprofits have had to shift a lot of their engagement, service delivery, and even just their day-to-day operations online. And Many nonprofits were not in a position to do so, did not have the resources or the capability. When we look at workplace giving, a very important channel, about $6 billion is given through workplace giving. Companies also face this challenge because in the past, workplace giving was done in person. They had to shift this online. So what we're looking at is an acceleration in innovation, a need for greater reliance on technology for giving. And we're also seeing many nonprofits pivot, in other words, take advantage of these new technologies. But that there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And I think as we look ahead, we're also going to need to think about some of the smaller organizations that haven't necessarily adapted at such a rapid rate. What do they need? And religious congregations, we should also remember, many of them had to start receiving donations online and may not have done so before. So what this highlights is just a gap in perhaps the need and where some of the organizations are at this point.
We're going to have to move on.
Thank you, Doctor.
I will tell Senator Young that his interest here is very welcome because we're seeing something of a tech boomlet here as it relates to ways in which we can wring more value out of these incredibly important charitable deductions. So good point. Senator Casey, and then we'll go with Senator Daines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel. I apologize I wasn't here for your testimony today. I had to chair the Aging Committee hearing and wasn't able to move between hearings, but really appreciate you being here today. Like so many senators, I've been supportive of the nonprofit sector and policies that facilitate responsible charitable giving. I also want to commend the nonprofit sector for their work, especially through the past couple of years of this pandemic, as they continue to serve during both an economic crisis and a health crisis. 63,000 nonprofits in Pennsylvania employ 15% of the Commonwealth's workforce. So in my home state, I can only extend my gratitude and respect for their work and their contributions. I just have two questions, one for Mr. Cardinale and one for Ms. Morgan, but I'll start with you, Mr. Cardinale. You referenced in your testimony the changing profile of charitable giving, mentioning that the state, or that the share of individual contributions would have declined if it were not for the donations of a few wealthy individuals. In our home state of Pennsylvania, my home state of Pennsylvania, households give 2.7% of their income to charities, but charitable contributions and their associated subsidies are disproportionately skewing to top earners. We know that the ability to deduct charitable contributions from your taxable income serves as a real incentive to give. What are the forces behind this changing profile of giving?
Thank you, Senator, for your leadership and support of the nonprofit sector. I spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania in my years with communities and schools, and you and your colleagues have been remarkable. There are a couple of things that I want to mention about your question. I think if we think about the incentive, and I mentioned this earlier in my testimony, that the charitable deduction is giving your money away for somebody else, not buying a home or being subsidized in any other way. So from a policy point of view, we believe that extending that incentive to everybody paying taxes is just good for community and good for America. Secondly, when the tax structure incentivizes those who are disproportionately economically better off, they will have a set of interests that might not be representative of the entire community. They might privilege organizations like universities, which I hold in high regard, or arts institutions, which are critically important to community. But they might not be in touch with or connected to organizations like food banks that could benefit immensely. And Ms. Morgan and I had breakfast yesterday morning, and she was talking about the number of donors that she had, and they are primarily small donors who aren't currently incentivized by the tax code. So I think if we just think at a basic level regarding a tax code that could really pull this altruism into community, how could we not benefit from it? There's a second piece that I'd like to mention about this point, and that is that when folks are incentivized to give, we know that they are then incentivized to volunteer. I ran an organization, Communities and Schools, with 4,000 staff and 40 to 60,000 volunteers. So without volunteers, we could not have developed an evidence-based intervention that mitigated the effects of poverty for K through 12 students. So donations are directly related to supporting volunteerism, which then is this public good that partners with government.
Thanks very much. Ms. Morgan, I ask you my final question. You had, in your testimony, talked about the ways the federal government can act to help organizations like the Oregon Food Bank to achieve your mission. And one statement in your testimony just leaped out at me. And I'm quoting here, the child tax credit alone drove down child poverty by an incredible 41% and reduced food insecurity by 26%. I think the first part of that we've heard a lot of people know because of the good work of Senator Brown, Senator Bennett, working with the finance chair, your home state senator, Senator Wyden. The child tax credit, the enhanced version of it, became a reality. We know it reduced poverty by that much, but we didn't hear nearly enough about the reduction in food insecurity by 26%. So that's a positive action the federal government took in the passage of the rescue plan. We also know that in addition to the positive impact it had, it reminded us how much of someone's income can be spent on food. We're told that 60% of low-income families who receive the child tax credit for the enhanced version spend it on food, 16% spend it on child care. We have one more opportunity to take full advantage of the rescue plan in the next couple of weeks, and that's to make people aware of a separate tax credit, the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, which will allow families to get up to $4,000 per child and up to $8,000 per household to pay for child care. Anything else other than those? I know there are others you could mention, and I know we're out of time, but if you could just mention one or two things in addition that you hope the federal government could invest in. And then I'm done.
Thank you, Senator. I'm not going to cite legislation for you because that's not my area of expertise, but I do want to say that you have amazing food banks in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Harrisburg, that are wonderful partners. And I would like to just drive home the fact that hunger is a symptom. Its cause is poverty. And poverty itself has a cause, which is systemic inequities. It's not an accident that our communities of color are more likely to be hungry. It's not an accident that single moms are more likely to be hungry. It's because we've designed systems to prevent prosperity and allowed those to happen. And so I would say that actions like the ones that you have suggested that redistribute wealth and tear down barriers to prosperity are exactly what we need our federal government to do.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague for all his good work.
Can I just add one quick footnote?
Very, very briefly, we still have Senator Daines and Senator Whitehouse, but go ahead, Doctor.
This is just very brief. Senator, for 10 years now, I sponsored, and now we have at Urban Institute put out something called Kids Share, and we measure what goes to kids in all these programs in the budget. So we're glad to provide that to you. I should add as a footnote to that almost all programs for children are scheduled to decline relative to GDP over time in the budget by the way that they're structured.
Very good. Senator Daines. Okay. And then Senator Whitehouse.
Chairman, thank you. I want to first start off by thanking our nonprofits in Montana and across our country for truly the tireless work they have done serving our communities during a couple of past 2 years, a couple of tough 2 years. Needless to say, there were a lot of challenges. Grateful our nonprofits stepped up, and it was good to see. But Montanans and Americans also stepped up to the plate. These nonprofits wouldn't be having better years without the fact we had people who were very generous, contributing a total of $324 billion in 2020. That's a 2.2% increase from 19 and the highest total dollar amount ever. When including bequests, foundations, corporations, a total of $471 billion was donated to charity in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic. And the enactment of legislation like the Legacy IRA Act, which has been introduced by Senators Kramer, Stabenow, Rosen, Cornyn, and myself, I believe would further boost charitable giving by expanding the amount that our seniors can gift to charity tax-free from their IRAs. The philanthropy of Americans certainly warms my heart and yours, but unfortunately, Congress is not doing enough to police some bad actors out there who are abusing the charitable section of the tax code. One area that comes to mind are the fraudulent syndicated conservation easement transactions that we've seen accelerate over the past several years. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, a grand jury returned an indictment against 7 defendants for their role in an abusive syndicated conservation easement scheme. According to the indictment, the defendants and their co-conspirators sold over $1.3 billion in false and fraudulent charitable contributions. These were, I should call it deductions, not a contribution there. These were essentially cookie-cutter deals in which investors were promised a 4-to-1 return on that money that they invested within a matter of months. As explained in marketing materials accompanying the deal, an investor who contributed $100,000 to the scheme could receive $170,000 back within months of purchasing their syndication units by claiming a $400,000 charitable deduction. The government has known about this very specific tax shelter for years, and yet it continues. According to the IRS, syndicators claimed nearly $36 billion in unwarranted deductions alone between 2010 and 2018, with $9.2 billion claimed in 2018. Senator Stabenow and I have legislation to put an end to these shady deals, which also has the support of the chairman, former Chairman Grassley, and other members of the Finance Committee and the Senate. I believe Congress needs to pass our bill this year. The abuse needs to end. And just to be very clear, I am very much pro-conservation easements. In fact, Montana is one of the leading states. It's a great way to incentivize in the private sector, private landowners in the realms of conservation. It's the abuse of these syndicates is the issue. Dr. Steuerle, this is just one example of a few bad actors unlawfully profiting under the guise of philanthropy. My question for you is, what could be done to better protect the integrity of charitable laws, which I fully support?
Well, Senator, this is really a tough issue, but tax administration is something, as everyone in this committee knows, it does not get well funded. So one thing is just simply to increase the money that goes into tax administration. But another, which is really tough, I think, and my testimony was largely about making trade-offs, is if we're willing to put in some tighter rules with respect to whether it's charitable contributions, how they're recognized, what can get by, and use those resources to fund the types of incentives that members of this committee want to provide. As you yourself have talked about, I think that's a way to corral the community, the charitable community, to join with you in this effort. I think one of the dilemmas, and I'm being quite blunt about it, is it's very hard for the community as a whole to speak out against particular other members. They might speak out against the greatest abuse, but when it comes to some simplification, say, okay, we're only going to allow easements when they meet certain tough criteria, you'll get feedback from those that probably good actors say, well, I don't want to bear the additional administrative costs. So my sense is the way to win this battle is to offer a higher incentive, say, we'll put that money towards a better charitable incentive, and that way we can get the members of the charitable community to join with you in this effort. Otherwise, I think it's often a losing battle to just pretend that we could just hope that maybe a couple more dollars to IRS is going to solve the problem. IRS should have more resources, but that's not enough. We really have to get the charitable community behind the type of effort you're talking about. And I mentioned some trade-offs here in terms of reporting as well. There's also an issue with 990 reporting, which IRS delays getting out. The individual taxpayer is one of your best sources for information on what's going on. The better we get 990 reporting put out to the public, as it's required to do, and on a timely basis, the better the individual taxpayer, the households out there, can join in your effort to create a stronger community.
Dr. Steuerle, I'm out of time. Let us end with a comment. The back on the good actors and bad actors. Again, there's many, many, many more good actors on conservation easement.
Fully agree.
And they are fully behind this legislation because it's a few bad actors here that are tainting the good efforts of our land trusts, who are very supportive. Would love to see this passed here, and I hope we can. We've got good bipartisan start here. I hope we can get this signed into law. Thank you.
The time of the gentleman has expired, and I want him to know, as we have talked about this issue so often, I'm in very strong support of this. As you know, then Chairman Grassley and I led efforts to look into these kinds of abuses. So there have been 4 of us on this committee, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. And Senator Daines, your point that you just explored here a minute ago is spot on in the sense that we know how important these are in the West, where the federal government owns so much of our land. And we're talking about a small minority that unfortunately is really abusing a very valuable tool for the vast majority of folks, particularly Westerners, who use it in a thoughtful way. So I just want you to know we're on this battle until we get it done. This is a chance for the 2 of us to send a message to all the scofflaws out there, the people that aren't being willing to be the majority and comply with the rules. We're going to stay at it until we fix this. Thank you.
Chairman, thanks for your support. I think I sense a movement.
Not just a movement, you see a grassroots mobilization. This is, and as you know, we've got a lot of businesses with us, environmental folks, businesses, community leaders, so we're on it. Thank you. Senator Whitehouse, we've got a vote on, and you may actually be at the vote.
Nope, I'm here.
There we are. We're going to have Senator Whitehouse, and then we are going to finish up. After Senator Whitehouse is done, I will give a lengthy closing address of about 2 minutes. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman, very much. My question has to do with donor-advised funds, and it's for Ms. Morgan. As you know, the connection between a charitable donation and the tax deduction for it is that it's to encourage people for the benefit that the public receives. With donor-advised funds, you have the predicament that the donor gets the deduction now, but the charitable benefit may not happen for years, and depending on a variety of circumstances, may not happen actually ever. There's an estimated $140 billion set aside for future gifts in donor-advised funds with no requirements for the funds to actually be distributed to charities. And one study taking a look at donor-advised funds found that 35% of them didn't make a single distribution in 2020, which was kind of a high-need year for charitable giving. So I'm working with a number of my colleagues on trying to have a reform of donor-advised funds. And I would like your thoughts on the importance of that. One of the pieces of pushback that we have gotten is that it creates a very significant administrative burden for the donor-advised fund, particularly ones that persist through time, where donations come in on year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, and then donations are going out year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, and you get into a very complicated piece of logistical tracking to try to identify when each dollar came in so you can find out when it went out and whether it met the distribution requirements. So if I could ask for your thoughts generally on whether this is an area that you think needs attention, and specifically if you have ideas on ways to grapple with the tracking of timing of individual dollars, sort of accounting predicament, I'd be grateful to hear you about that. And if anybody else cares to chime in, please, I don't want to extend the hearing, but please do feel free to send in a response as if I'd asked you a question for the record. Send in a written response. So with that, Ms. Morgan.
Thank you very much, Senator. I'm sure that my colleagues at Independent Sector have a wealth of research and some very specific policy recommendations on this. From where I sit on the ground, we track our inventory like that. We get a donation of a truckload of oranges. We have to know when they show up and when they go out and who they go to. So I am not particularly sympathetic to complex tracking requirements because I live with them every day. Our sense is that hunger is a crisis right now. Before the pandemic, it was 1 in 5 Oregonians. It's gone up to as close to 1 in 4 during the pandemic. The idea that money is getting tucked away that is not benefiting our neighbors, our communities, ourselves right now is anathema to me. Philanthropy means the love of humankind. And the acts of philanthropy is an act of showing love. Should there be charitable incentives to encourage that love? Of course there should. Like, giving ice cream to a kid for getting a good grade on an exam. But the getting a good grade is a reward in itself, and participating in the community is a reward in itself. I believe that, in general, charities are with you, Senator, on the idea for the need for reform for donor-advised funds, and that it needs to be crafted carefully so that it doesn't have unintended consequences.
Good. Well, thank you. I'll use the last 30 seconds of my time to support what the chairman said about our common interest in making sure that conservation easements are used properly and honestly. My father is no longer with us, but he spent his retirement as chairman of the Piedmont Environmental Council, which at one point had the most dense array of conservation easements anywhere in the country, and did an outstanding job of preserving that historic countryside. So I'm a firm believer in the value of conservation easements and happy to be a part of Team Wyden and Team Danes on that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse, and for all your leadership on environmental issues. Terrific panel. Thank you all so much. I especially want to thank my good friend Susanna Morgan for making the trek to Washington, D.C., a trek of more than 3,000 miles. She may beat me home because it looks like I'm going to be doing the red eye tonight to make it to Central Oregon first thing in the morning, but I really want to thank her and for all her leadership. It's been a terrific panel. Senator Crapo is, of course, the ranking minority member. He has been involved in a number of matters that have involved negotiations this morning, and he really wanted to be here. We are going to work on this in a bipartisan way. That's the way we try to do everything that we possibly can. Now, it isn't always possible, and I always kind of use that because with respect to the child tax credit, I went to the floor of the United States Senate in December, and I asked unanimous consent to extend the expiring child tax credit for a year. And unfortunately, there was an objection from the other side of the aisle. So then I came back in January, and I asked unanimous consent to, again, extend the child tax credit for a year. And again, there was an objection from the other side. So sometimes it's not possible. But I'll tell you, there are a lot of opportunities right now for bipartisanship. You've given us an enormously important one as it relates to charitable giving. We're also working in a bipartisan way with respect to competing with China, mental health, retirement savings. So I really appreciate your giving us a very good update on what the challenges are. And apart from the fact that we're still coming out of a crisis, the pandemic, we want to give more certainty and predictability to all of you so that you're in a position to talk to workers and donors and others. Here's where I think we stand, not just for the next 15 minutes, but for the days ahead. You've given us a lot of good ideas. And let me also say that for the record, the questions are due on March 24th. Members have to submit their questions for the record by March 24th. We thank all our guests again. With that, the Finance Committee is adjourned.